welcome. Glad you can all be here. So if you would like to open your Bible, we will be in 1 Samuel chapters 20 and 21. And we are going to be reading chapter 21 as our intro tonight because it's a little bit shorter. Chapter 20 has about 40-some verses in it. So we are going to pick it up sort of with the second part of the story this evening as we get into our teaching. Just taking a moment here to bring all this up. And I get it to the right place. There we go. Great. So 1 Samuel chapter 21 is what we will be reading. As we jump in tonight, we will come back and cover 20 and 21. Beginning with chapter 21. Now David said to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid when he met David, and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one is with you?" So David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has ordered me on some business, and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you, or what I have commanded you, and I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now therefore what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found.' And the priest answered David and said, 'There is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women.' Then David answered the priest and said to him, 'Truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was sanctified in the vessel this day.' So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. And David said to Ahimelech, 'Is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste.' So the priest said, 'The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, there it is, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is no other except that one here.' And David said, 'There is none like it. Give it to me.' Then David arose and fled that day from before Saul, and went to Achish the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, 'Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? Now David took these words to heart, and was very much afraid of Achish the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, feigned madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, 'Look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen, that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?' Lord, as we read this and chapter 20 together, we trust that you will open our understanding and open our hearts to receive all that you have in your word for us. We trust that you will make sense of these crazy things that are going on here in these 2 chapters, and help us to understand not only what it meant then, but what it means now as we read it today, and how it should be speaking to us and informing us in how we live our lives. We open our hearts to you, Lord. We ask you to speak because your servants are listening. In Jesus' name, amen. So back in chapter 20, you may recall from our story last week that King Saul was feeling threatened by David. And so in chapter 20, David had fled from before the presence of Saul. And now David is going out and he's seeking the presence of Jonathan, his good friend. So in chapter 20, verse 1, then David fled from Naioth and Ramah and went and said to Jonathan, what have I done? What is my iniquity and what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life? Remember, previously we read that Jonathan and David had formed sort of a bond, a covenant. Not just a friendship, a deep bond of friendship. It's interesting as you read the different commentators, some feel there's maybe only 5 or so years between Jonathan and David, and some feel there may have been as much as 20 years between the two of them. Certainly, Jonathan was much older than David. This chapter would seem to imply that there is an older than 5-year kind of a gap just by the way they are interacting. So Jonathan said to him in verse 2, by no means, you shall not die. Indeed, my father will do nothing, either great or small, without first telling me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. So David comes in, speaking to his good friend, saying, I think your father's got it in for me. Well, he's thrown the spear at him a few times, right, while he's been in the presence of the king. Jonathan may not have been present every time these things had happened, but Jonathan is sort of in disbelief that his father would act in such a treacherous way toward David, and probably in some respects blinded by his love and his deep care for his friend David. Verse 3, then David took an oath again and said, your father certainly knows that I found favor in your eyes. He knows we're friends. He knows we're buddies. And he has said, do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. So David, perhaps for the first time in his life, is realizing that life hangs in a balance. And it's interesting that in all that time, going back to David's youth, that as he was a shepherd out in the field, and remember in leading up to the killing of Goliath, he had said, I used to kill the bear and the lion, and that was no problem. This Philistine, this uncircumcised Philistine is no different, so no problem. We can take care of this. And he's standing against the Lord's anointed anyway, so why would we stand for this? God will help us. God will fight for us. And now, as Saul is raging against David, we see David saying, hey, there's but a step between me and death. And this is somewhat of a pattern we see in God's servants, where sometimes after great victory, sometimes after a great bout of faith and trusting in God, we sort of come down, off the mountain, so to speak, and we reach a low point in our lives. And it would seem that David is starting to trough down into this low point, and we'll see as we go along tonight that he kind of takes a step back for a little while. He falters a bit. So Jonathan said to David, verse 4, whatever you yourself desire, I will do it for you. We're still friends. I'm going to look out for you. And David said to Jonathan, indeed, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit with the king to eat. So when these regular feasts came around, those who served the king and in the king's court were expected to be present. So David says, let me go, that I may hide in the field until the third day at evening. If your father misses me at all, and sort of the implication here, the table is so big, perhaps he won't miss me, then say, if you will. So David's really asking his friend to lie to him before his father. So this is sort of the downward slide. David earnestly asked permission of me that night that he might run over to Bethlehem, his city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the family. If he says thus, it is well, your servant will be safe. So once again, sort of laying out the fleece, laying out the, just like Jonathan did earlier when he and his servant or his armor bearer went before the armies, and they said, well, let's go up and let's sort of say, well, if they say this, then we'll know the Lord is with us, and if they say thus, then we'll know the Lord is not for us. And so sort of the same thing here. If your father answers and says, it is well, your servant will be safe, but if he is angry, be sure that evil is determined by him. Therefore you shall deal kindly with your servant, verse 8, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. So sort of appealing to him on the basis of that covenant that they formed earlier between themselves and the Lord. Nevertheless, if there is iniquity in me, kill me yourself, Jonathan. You're the king's son. If there truly is something in me, if I've done evil, if I've broken the law, if I've offended your father, then I would rather you kill me, is what he's saying, than your father. For why should you bring me to your father? And sort of, I think, behind the scenes here is, you're his son. It would be better for you to come and say, I've killed your father enemy. I've taken vengeance on him for you, and that would leave you in good standing with your father. But Jonathan, verse 9, said, far be it from you, for if I knew certainly that evil was determined by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you? I mean, are we friends or not? Do I love you or not? Am I not faithful to you? Of course, I would tell you if I knew. Then David said to Jonathan, who will tell me, or what if your father answers you roughly? And Jonathan said to David, so now Jonathan comes around to David's sort of way of dealing with things, and he says, okay, come, let us go out into the field. So both of them went out into the field. Then Jonathan said to David, the Lord God of Israel is witness. When I have sounded out my father sometime tomorrow or the third day, and indeed there is good toward David, and I do not send to you and tell you, may the Lord do so and much more to Jonathan. But if it pleases my father to do you evil, then I will report it to you and send you away that you may go in safety. And the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. And you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I sit, that I may not die. While I still live, that I may not die. But you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. So what's happening in this interaction here, as Jonathan is saying to David, we're going to set up a little way of communicating here out in the field, and he's going to go through in a moment and describe, come out and I'll shoot arrows, and if they go in a certain direction, I'll shout to my servant, my lad, go over there, and if you hear me say that, then you'll know my father is for you. And if you hear me say the other thing, then you'll know my father is against you. But as Jonathan begins to speak to him, he sort of reaffirms the fact that he believes the promise of God, as God has anointed David to be king, that David would be raising up David to replace his father. So he's confirming in this oath that I will show you this kindness, but then he says, you have to show me a kindness that long after I'm gone in my household and my descendants, verse 15, you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. So I'd like to read this little paragraph to you because I think it helps sort of put everything in perspective of what's happening here. Jonathan was aware of the political dynamic between the family of David and the family of Jonathan. In those days, and this is true, you can see this throughout the scriptures, when one royal house replaced another, it was common for the new royal house to kill all of the potential rulers from the old royal house, lest there be an uprising. Jonathan knew that one day David and his descendants would rule over Israel, and he wanted to promise that David and his descendants will not kill or mistreat the descendants of Jonathan. We're going to find out in just a moment how that promise was fulfilled. But in verse 16, Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord require it at the hand of David's enemies. So we see not only the love and the bond between them through this covenant of love that they have, But Jonathan is also negotiating for his family, for the future. Now, Jonathan, verse 17, again caused David to vow, because he loved him, for he loved him as his own soul. Now, we'll get to this in 2 Samuel, but in 2 Samuel chapter 9, if you want to turn there, one of Jonathan's descendants was a crippled young man named Mephibosheth. And in 2 Samuel chapter 9, we find, beginning in verse 1, now David said, is there still anyone who is left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? So this is after Jonathan and Saul have died. They've been killed. And David is seeking to fulfill this covenant that they made on this day in that field, as Jonathan is swearing his allegiance to David, and he's asking David for a favor that one day when we're gone, you're king, and there's descendants in my household, that you would show favor. So as you read through chapter 9, you come down to verse 6. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. He's basically coming to beg for mercy. Then David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, here is your servant. So David said to him, do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. In other words, David is essentially adopting Mephibosheth into his family and saying, you will eat at the royal table because of the covenant between Jonathan, and observing the fact that Saul was previously the king, even though he turned from the Lord, but he was the Lord's anointed. So David has an honorable heart to, take care of these promises. And as you follow on down in 2 Samuel chapter 9, you come to sort of the end of that chapter, verse 11. Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king has commanded his servant, so will your servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who dwelt in the house of Ziba were servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth, verse 13, dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both his feet. So he was not only a descendant, but he was crippled. And David had this deep love in his heart for his friend Jonathan, and he had purposed that he would honor it. And many, many years later, after he's the king, he makes good on that promise. How often do we see someone make a promise and not only keep it, but honor it many, many, many years into the future? Verse 18 in chapter 20, then Jonathan said to David, tomorrow's the new moon, and you will be missed because your seat will be empty. So they're setting up the communication scenario. And when you have stayed 3 days, go down quickly and come to the place where you hid on the day of the deed, and remain by the stone of Ezel. Then I will come out, I'll shoot 3 arrows to the side, as though I shot at the target, and there I will send a lad, saying, go find the arrows. If I expressly say to the lad, look, the arrows are on this side of you, get them and come, then as the Lord lives, there is safety for you and no harm. In other words, my father intends no evil. Verse 22, but if I say thus to the young man, look, the arrows are beyond you, go your way, for the Lord has sent you away. And as for the matter which you and I have spoken of, indeed, the Lord be between you and me forever. In other words, may the Lord cause us to honor that bond and that covenant. Verse 24, then David hid in the field, and when the new moon had come, the king sat down to eat the feast. Now the king sat on his seat, as at other times, on a seat by the wall. And Jonathan arose, and Abner sat by Saul's side, but David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul did not say anything that day, for he thought, something has happened to him, he is unclean, surely he is unclean. What he's talking about there is when these feasts took place, if someone had inadvertently defiled themselves ceremonially, they would be excused from the king's presence. And it was common, they had so many laws and whatnot around purity that if, they touched something that they shouldn't have touched, or they did something out of order, then they would become unclean, and it would have been a huge sin to be in the king's presence, to be unclean, to not admit it, and to not act and to treat themselves in the proper manner. So the king's just assuming that on the first day, any absences he sees is because people are purifying themselves because they did something that made themselves unclean. So in verse 27, and it happened on the next day, day 2 of the feast, the second day of the month, that David's place was empty. And Saul said to Jonathan his son, "Why has the son of Jesse not come to eat, either yesterday or today?" So here we go. So Jonathan answered Saul, "David earnestly asked permission of me to go to Bethlehem," so he's playing it out just as they determined. "And he said, 'Please let me go, for our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to be there. And now, if I have found favor in your eyes, please let me get away and see my brothers.' Therefore he has not come to the king's table." Verse 30, then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame?" I know you love him. You love him more than me, basically is what he's saying. "And to the shame of your own mother's nakedness." I suspect, as Saul says these things, that this is essentially cursing in Hebrew. And to say something like that, "you son of a perverse, rebellious woman," he's blaming his son's, as he's viewing it, deceitful and traitor-like behavior on his mother. So if I were one of the king's servants sitting around the table, I'd probably be like, right now, la, 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 I don't want to hear this in case she asked me if you really said that. I'm not going to get in trouble, so I'm out of here. That's probably what I would have done. But the king obviously is very angry. Now watch this in verse 31. "For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom." In other words, he's threatening his son because Saul still has the perspective that even though God said to him, the kingdom's going to be taken from you, he's thinking, I'm going to pass it on to my son. But now he's threatening his son. He's holding it over his head saying, because you have this friendship with David, I'm not going to allow the kingdom to pass to you, Jonathan, because of your disloyalty to me. Now, therefore, send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. In other words, you go get the guy that you're saying is your friend, and you bring him to me, and I'll kill him, and then I'll let you be the king. And Jonathan answered Saul his father, verse 32, and said to him, "Why should he be killed? What has he done?" Remember, they've had this conversation before, previously. Verse 33, then Saul cast a spear at him, his own son, to kill him, by which Jonathan knew, at that point, you think, was determined by his father to kill David. You see, Jonathan's support of David, his love of David, enraged his father Saul. And as his father cast the spear at him, just as he had done at David, this revealed how deeply Saul hated David, and I'm sure was quite, not only a shock, but just, it wounded his heart, knowing that his father hated his friend and the man who was supposed to be the heir to the throne, according to the prophet Samuel. And he was threatening to kill his own son for siding with David. He viewed Jonathan as a traitor. Verse 34, so Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger. So now he's angry back at his dad for treating him that way. And he ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had treated him shamefully. And so it was in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field at the time appointed with David, and a little lad was with him. I imagine his heart was incredibly heavy. And then he said to his lad, verse 36, now run, find the arrows which I shoot. As the lad ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. And when the lad had come to the place where the arrow was, which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan cried out after the lad and said, "Is not the arrow beyond you?" That was the sign. And Jonathan cried out after the lad, "Make haste, hurry, do not delay." So Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and came back to his master, but the lad did not know anything. Only Jonathan and David knew what was going on. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to his lad and said to him, "Go, carry them to the city. Leave me alone." And as soon as the lad had gone, David arose from a place toward the south, fell on his face to the ground, and bowed 3 times. And they kissed one another, and they wept together, but David more so. Can you imagine this scene? A scene between 2 men. You know, to men, we don't like to show emotion, right? But here are 2 men, Jonathan and David, who both loved the Lord and who both loved each other. And they are weeping together because they know it's not that their friendship is over, but we're about to find out this will be the last time that they see each other. They'll know they can't be, seen together anymore. They can't maintain their friendship because of Saul's anger. And so they kissed one another. There's all sorts of people out there, liberal scholars, who say, they were gay. Of course not. That's the most foolish thing ever. It's just brotherly love. And of course, the Middle Eastern greeting, of course, was kissing someone on the cheek. And I go to Italy all the time, and they're still doing that today. They do it to me when I go over there, but I don't feel offended. And so these men are deeply grieved. They're weeping. And it says, but David more so. And David, I'm sure what he felt was, I'm not going to see Jonathan anymore. Verse 42, then Jonathan said to David, and I'm sure this is, the messy, blubbering kind of cry, and he's finally, through the tears, and they've stopped heaving and all of that, and he says, go in peace. Since we have both sworn in the name of the Lord, we've got to honor what we said we were going to do, saying, may the Lord be between you and me and between your descendants and my descendants forevermore. This is the farewell. So David arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. We know this is the last time they saw each other. Historically, as we go through the story, we'll find that out. And no doubt that was the reason for the weeping. But here's something that's interesting that God's beginning to do in David's life, and we'll see this as we move into chapter 21. The bleak road was important in David's life because if God would put David in a place where people must depend on him, God would teach David to depend upon God alone. Not himself, not Saul, not Jonathan, not anyone except God. What's happening is this: God is stripping away everything familiar from David. His friends, his counselors, his support system. Things and people we trust and we trusted. So often God says it's time for those things that are familiar to you, that are easy for you to fall back on, to be removed from your life. Why? To learn to lean upon and to trust only in the Lord. Alan Redpath, if you've never read anything by him, this man was, God communed with this guy. Here's what he said about this situation. Let God empty you out, that he may save you from becoming spiritually stale and lead you ever onward. He is always calling us to pass beyond the thing we know into the unknown. A throne is God's purpose for you. A cross is God's path for you. Faith is God's plan for you. Let me read that again. A throne is God's purpose for you. A cross is God's path for you. And faith is God's plan for you. God is stripping away from David everything he knew and loved and depended on so that he has to learn to trust God. Now in chapter 21, which is the chapter we read coming into our study, David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. So now he's left Jonathan, he's running, he has nothing. He's left everything. And Ahimelech was afraid when he met David. Why? Because David didn't usually travel alone. David would have been dressed probably differently. And so he's out there running. And when he met him, he said to him, "Why are you alone, and why is no one with you?" He knew David. He knew that he was an emissary of the king's court. They knew David was the one who killed Goliath. So David says to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has ordered me on some business." So what does he start to do here? He's spinning a yarn. He's telling a lie. "Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I sent you or what I've commanded you." He's saying that's what the king told him. "And I have directed my young men to such and such a place." That's why I'm alone. I'm out doing this special mission, this secret mission for the king. "Now, therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found. I'm hungry. I need some supplies." And the priest answered David and said, "There is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread. If the young men," speaking of the ones who supposedly are wherever, "have kept themselves from women." Then David answered the priest and said to him, "Truly women have been kept from us." So he's just making all this up, spinning it. Now the interesting thing here about this situation, and I'll read this to you, this sort of describes the whole process of what was going back into the law when God established the tent of meeting and then later would establish the temple. What is this whole process of the table with the showbread before the Lord? The tabernacle of the Lord had a table that held 12 loaves of bread, symbolizing God's continual fellowship with Israel. The importance and meaning of the bread is found in its name. Literally, showbread means bread of faces. It is bread associated with and to be eaten before the face of God. One person calls the bread the presence bread. To eat the showbread was to eat God's bread in God's house as a friend and a guest of the Lord, enjoying the hospitality of the Lord. In that culture, eating together formed a bond of friendship that was permanent and sacred. The showbread was always to be fresh. Ahimelech would give David the old showbread that had been removed that morning when the fresh bread was put in its place. And that bread was thought to be meant only for the priests, but if you go back and read, it doesn't say that it's only for the priests. God wants our fellowship with him and our time before his face to be fresh. So David answered the priest and said, "Yes, the women have been kept from us about 3 days, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day." Verse 6, "So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away." If this story sounds a little bit familiar to you, it's because in Matthew chapter 12, and you're welcome to turn there if you like, this situation was relived by Jesus before the Pharisees. So Matthew 12, 1 through 8. "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath,' because they viewed it as reaping a harvest, as doing work on the Sabbath. But Jesus said to them, 'Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the showbread which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple,'" referring to himself. "But if you had known what this means, 'I desire mercy and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now Jesus would later say, I want you to understand that Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. The idea is simply this: human need outweighs eating the showbread. And he's saying here, as David rightly understood, that the bread that had been taken from the presence of the Lord and had been replaced by the fresh bread that was on the table. Yeah, we're not going to touch the bread on the table because that's the daily bread before the Lord, but that had been removed and had been given to David. While it would have been viewed as questionable, to say the least, David took it. And so Jesus reaches back to this example of David, pulls it forward and says, look, the Sabbath is here to serve us. Now, verse 7, a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day when David showed up to the priest and detained before the Lord. Now, that's interesting. People have kind of, what does this mean here when it says that this man, this servant of Saul, was detained before the Lord? Most believe that this is probably referring to sort of a divine appointment, that this guy is there. We would say by chance it just so happened he was there, but it would seem the Lord had him be there. And his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. So in other words, David's running from the presence of Saul, but one of Saul's closest emissaries is there, and he sees David going in and asking for the bread. Now, the name Doeg, remember the names always mean something, and it's always appropriate. Doeg's name means fearful or anxious. So it would seem to imply this guy is sort of a nervous Nelly, we might say today. And apparently Doeg later went back from this point and told Saul about David. Now, stitching some things together for you, hold your finger here and go over to Psalm 52. We know that so often if you read through the Psalms, so often there's a little heading there, not one put in by the translators, but one put in by David or by the psalm writer himself. So in Psalm 52, verse 1, here's the inscription: to the chief musician, a contemplation of David. So David wrote this. When Doeg the Edomite did what? Went and told Saul and said to him, David has gone to the house of Ahimelech. So it's referring to this very thing that is happening here that we're reading about. And here's what it reads. It's a relatively short psalm. Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The goodness of God endures continually. Get that David's perspective. Now this perspective is much later. Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor working deceitfully. So this is attributing to Doeg the evil intent to go and to tell King Saul where David was and thus bring evil upon David. Verse 3, you love evil more than good, lying rather than speaking righteousness, Selah. You love all devouring words, you deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy you forever. He shall take you away and pluck you out of your dwelling place and uproot you from the land of the living. This is basically what happened to David, right? And that he says Selah. Remember, Selah can mean pause or crescendo or stop to think about it, depending on the context. I don't think this is crescendo. I think this is pause and think about it. The righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him, saying, here is the man who did not make God his strength. Notice the perspective. Yeah, you're Doeg. Yes, you mean evil, but you haven't made God your strength. Therefore, what you do will not succeed. But trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But I'm like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise you, speaking of God, forever, because you have done it. And in the presence of your saints, I will wait on your name, for it is good. After this situation, because as we continue to read here, we understand that David's getting a little discouraged. He's probably gotten a little fearful. Doeg saw me. He's headed back to the king to tell on me and to reveal my position. In verse 8, David said to Ahimelech, is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? So he's starting to get a little nervous and take on the characteristics of Doeg. He's getting fearful. Anxiety's coming in. I need a weapon. I've got to protect myself. And the priest says, basically priests didn't keep weapons on hand, but he's got, the sword of Goliath that you killed him with, his own sword, it's over there behind something wrapped in a cloth. If you want that, take it, but that's it. That's all we've got. And David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. Now, if we remember back to the story about Goliath, remember Goliath was 9.5 feet tall. Everything he had was huge. Remember that said the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, all of that. So most likely the sword of Goliath that David was able to pick up and to wield and to cut off his head with, if he were to put it on his side like a sword would be most likely carried, it probably would have drugged the ground because it was so big. So David's like, well, give me the sword, I'll take it. But, there's this sort of almost comical thing that here's David, probably 5'8" or something like that, and he's carrying this sword that's probably taller than him. And so David takes the sword. So the priest said, the sword of Goliath here, take it. And there's none other. And David said, I'll take it. Here's something that the people who write about these things said that I thought was appropriate, because this is where David's head is. David can have the sword of Goliath in his arsenal, but he would be better equipped if he had the faith that he used to kill Goliath, rather than the sword of Goliath. Is David now trusting in Philistine swords more than the shepherd tools that God had given him so long ago? There was nothing wrong with Goliath's sword. The Lord had used it before, but only in the context of a radical faith that God had given him in the moment. David, it would seem, had lost confidence in God and in fulfillment of God's purpose for his life, which had been revealed to him. He went to God's house for comfort and help and guidance, but he was detected as being wrong in his soul. Instead of acknowledging the truth to the only one who could help him and confessing that he had been telling a lie, he ran for his life again. So as David comes in to the house of the Lord there to the priest, he begins to lie to protect himself. He begins to concoct schemes to deliver his own hand, his own self, from the hand of his enemies. And this reminds me, as I think about it, remember when Abraham was with Sarah and they were out sort of running. And two times, Abraham said to Sarah, lie for us, say that you're not my wife, for you're very beautiful. And remember that God preserved him. God protected him from his own foolishness, from his own madness. And I think we're going to see that God, in his gracious mercy, is going to deliver David. But in verse 10, we see now that David, as he flees, David arose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. Something that's probably worth mentioning here, Jesse, there's a slide there, if you can pull that up, please. Okay. So often when we read through the Bible, I'm sure you've probably read this, if you've read through the Old Testament, you see these names, and sometimes you wonder what these names mean. And when we get that up there, you'll see that there's what I would call pseudonyms, or names that would be used for kings. So the king Achish, in other passages, is referred to as Abimelech. Abimelech is a title. His name was Achish. In Turkish, the name would be Sultan. In Russian, the name would be Tsar. In Egyptian, of course, Pharaoh. And in Assyrian, he would be referred to as Sennacherib. So those are titles on the left. And of course, they would refer to the king, whoever they were talking about at that time. So this is just bonus material. I find this kind of stuff really helpful. When you're reading and you're trying to make sense of, well, who's Sennacherib and who's Abimelech and, all of that. You got to know who you're talking about at the particular time. So that's just there as something to help you understand. When we see later Achish referred to as Abimelech, that, this is who it's referring to. You can take that down, please. Thank you. So David now, here's the thing. David has run into the camp of the Philistines. This is how far he's gone in his fear. So he's seeking that among the Philistines. Remember, David made war against them. Remember when he killed Goliath? They massacred the Philistines. So now here's the thing. Gath is where Goliath was from. So he's walking into Gath, dragging the sword of their champion, seeking asylum from the house of his enemy. And you're like, does this make any sense? And the answer is, of course it doesn't make any sense. But this is an example, a stark example of what can happen to us when we, in fear, depart from following the Lord by faith and we begin to just take action on our own. And so this is where David is. And so in verse 11, and the servants of Achish said to him, now wait a minute, isn't this David the king of the land? Did they not sing to him, to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? In other words, this is kind of like, when the Patriots were good and we won football games, we have our big Super Bowl parade, right? And then we beat, say Atlanta. But now we take the Patriots plane and bus down through Atlanta and we drive through the middle and we go, hey, we're just here to have a little time, taking a vacation here in your town. Hopefully you'll treat us nicely. When in reality they would hate us. And that's the same is true of anyone, right? And David is walking into this town. Just his head is not screwed on straight right now. Now David took these words to heart, verse 12. So you probably know this. Hopefully you haven't had to do it, but probably all of us has done this at one time or another. Once you tell a lie and you get into a situation, you keep telling more lies, and then you lose track of where the truth was and how many lies you had to tell to get to where you are to try and preserve yourself. So here's what happens in verse 13. So David changed his behavior before them. He walks into town. He realizes, this probably wasn't a good idea. And now he starts to improvise. He changed his behavior before them. He pretended madness in their hands. He scratched on the doors of the gate, and he let his saliva fall down on his beard. He just starts to act like a crazy man. And he just begins to spit and just let it run down his mouth, almost like he's having a seizure. I mean, he's like, I've got to do something to try and save myself in this moment. And Achish, verse 14, said to his servants, look, you see the man, he's insane. Why did you bring him to me? Now, turn over to Psalm 34. You've probably read this before, but here's the context. Psalm 34, our title is Taste and See that the Lord is Good. And again, David is writing this much later after this event. Here's what it says. Let's read through it. A psalm of David when he what? Pretended madness, or your translation may say feigned madness, before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed. So we're seeing David out of his mind, right? He's not making good decisions. He's sinning, essentially, before the Lord. He's lying and all these things. And all of a sudden, he improvises and pretends to be a crazy man. Here's his perspective afterward, looking back on it. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. It wasn't at that moment, was it? My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear of it and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears. They looked to him and were radiant, and their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried out. So I think what he's describing is this was what was going on in my heart while I was acting like a foolish person. This poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around all those who fear him and delivers them. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in him. Oh, fear the Lord, you his saints. There is no want to those who fear him. The young lions lack and suffer hunger, but those who seek the Lord shall not lack any good thing. You can tell the deep lessons that David has learned from the foolishness that he did before the king. Come, you children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Who is the man who desires life and loves many days? Peter quotes this passage. That he may see good. Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Well, where did he learn that from? Because of all of the lies, he just fell into this trap and just started telling lie after lie after lie. The Lord will bless those who tell the truth, not those who lie. The face of the Lord, sorry, I missed my place here. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to those who have a broken heart. I don't think he had a broken heart at the moment, but I think later he did when he repented. And he saves such as have a contrite heart. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. Maybe you should underline verse 19. This is one of those promises that the name it and claim it people don't tell you about. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He guards all his bones, not one of them is broken. Evil shall slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous shall be condemned. The Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of those who trust in him shall be condemned. As we finish the story in verse 15, have I need of madmen, that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? So as we see David in the story, he lost all of his judgment. He wasn't following the Lord. He was living in fear. But later he learned from it. And in looking back on it later, he said, boy, did I learn a lesson. Boy, did I learn that I wasn't trusting in God. Boy, did I learn that God delivers even the stupid people from their devices. So often, God does allow us to experience the consequences of our sin. We know that. But also, God, because he's infinitely gracious and mercy, so often in our stupidity will kind of pick us up and go, you know what? That was so dumb. We're just going to keep going, all right? We're going to learn from that. And that's why it's so important when you read these things, these titles in the Psalms, to go back and say, well, what happened? And when you read Psalm 34 and looking back at this passage, you're like, it's like night and day. What David did and the foolishness and how he learned that God delivered him out of his foolishness. If you'll indulge me once more, turn to Psalm 56. The title of that psalm is In God I Trust, and here's how the title of it reads. To the chief musician, set to the silent dove in distant lands, a miktam of David when the Philistines captured him in Gath. Another lesson that David learns. Be merciful to me, O God, for man would swallow me up. Fighting all day, he oppresses me. My enemies would hound me all day, for there are many who fight against me, O Most High. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. What is he learning? Don't let fear drive you anywhere but to the feet of God. Don't allow fear to control you and begin to make decisions out of fear. When I am afraid, I will trust in you. We sing this in songs. In God I will praise his word. In God I have put my trust. I will not fear. What can flesh do to me? All day they twist my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They gather together, they hide, they mark my steps. When they lie in wait for my life, shall they escape by iniquity? In anger cast down the peoples, O God. You number my wanderings. Put my tears into your bottle. Are they not in your book? When I cry out to you, then my enemies will turn back. Not cry in front of my enemies, but when I cry out to God, when I say, God, help me. I can't do it. I've messed up. They're hemming me in. This I know because God is for me. You see, fear says to us, I don't believe God can deliver me. Fear says, I don't believe God can deliver me, that he will deliver me. And I don't believe that God is bigger than the situation I find myself in. But when I cry out to you, my enemies will turn. This I know because God is for me. And notice what he says, Psalm 56:10, in God I will praise his word. In the Lord I will praise his word. In God I have put my trust. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? Vows made to you, God, are binding upon me. In other words, if I make a vow to God, I will trust in you. I better follow through with it. I will render praises to you, for you have delivered my soul from death. Have you not kept my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of the living? We've looked at 3 Psalms that came out of this situation, where when David was in the situation, he failed. But he learned from the situation. He didn't allow it to keep it down. And you see, this is what separated David from Saul. Because Saul, when he panicked, when he walked away from the Lord, when he lived in fear, when he had anxiety, he pressed into the anxiety. He lived in fear, and he ran away from God. But when God says to David, this is a man after my own heart, this is why. And this should give you and me incredible confidence. Because we fail all the time, don't we? All the time. This isn't blessing our sin, but this is saying when we fall, when we falter, when we fail, we turn to the Lord. When we give in to fear, we come back to God. And then we read Psalms like this. This is why Psalm 34 is one of my favorites. Because as you read this, David is crying out to God saying, oh, Lord, I was so dumb. Forgive me. Lord, I want to taste and see that you are good. I want to remember this moment when you not only heard me, but you delivered me. And that's why I called this, God graciously strips away and God delivers. God was stripping David down so that David would learn to trust in him and not Jonathan and not Saul and not his armor and not all of those things, not his family. David had to learn to depend upon God and upon God alone. And if you ever go through a time of purging and pressing where God removes from your life all that you love and all that is familiar, I think David would say, press into it. Allow God to do his work and learn the lesson of falling into the arms of God, into the faithful Creator who loves us. Let Psalm 34 be your guide. What an amazing thing we can learn from David. Yes, he failed, but he kept turning back to God. He kept repenting. And let that be the story of our lives, that we keep coming back. We keep clawing our way back to God. We keep crying out to him. We keep beating our breasts saying, be merciful to me, a sinner. Let God draw you near. Let him draw you close so that we can learn to cry out to him. Lord, thank you that even though you do strip away and you purge, you do it to draw us near. You do it to deliver us, God. You do it to teach us. Depend upon no one and nothing except you. Not money, not bank accounts, not cars, not houses, not friends, but you and you alone, our health. And God, sometimes when, I think Corrie ten Boom said it when she said, learn to hold things lightly, because if we don't, then when God removes it from our hand, if he has to rip it out of our hand, that'll hurt, and we don't want it to hurt if God has to remove it. God, that we might learn to press into you, the way David learned to press into you, and that we could say along with him, I am tasting and seeing how the Lord is good. I am learning to fear the Lord. I am learning that the Lord is near to those who are humble and have a broken heart and a contrite spirit. I am learning that the Lord redeems the soul of his servants. Lord, may that be our testimony. May that be our path. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you.